Now, before we get fully underway, I'd also like to recognize that CIC Victoria members, we live, work, and learn on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. For those of you that are not familiar with the CIC, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven organization with a mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and Canada's place in the world. And we have branches in 18 cities across the country with some 1,400 members and an active young professional network as well. And you can find out more about us just by Googling the Canadian International Council. Now, as for today, after our introductions, our speaker will speak for 25 to 30 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A portion. And for this portion, for the Q&A, just use the function at the bottom. I'm sure all of you are used to it, and we will do our best to get to the questions, all of them, if we can. And as mentioned, we are recording this event. Now, our moderator today, I'm delighted to introduce Nguyen Khac Giang, who is a doctoral legal researcher at the University of Victoria. He also plays the role of research associate and legal advisor for several human rights NGOs and political think tanks in Asia. His research and analysis have appeared in many established journals and news outlets, including the Cambridge Journal of International Law, and all the way to CIC's own Open Canada, where he recently had an article in there as well. Now, his work covers a wide range of interests, including state responsibilities, the law of armed conflict, and ASEAN's experience with international law. He's also the Vice President Research of CIC's Young Professional Network, and he's our event organizer as well for today. So, Trung, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you to welcome our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Grace, for your very kind introduction, and thank you for your perfect pronunciation of my name, actually. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first event of Victoria Young Professional Network at the Canadian International Council that I am able to host with the support of Chris. And maybe there will be an anniversary or something in the future. But join me and Chris today is Dr. Nguyen Khac Giang. He holds a PhD in political science from the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He has one award-winning book on civil society in Vietnam, and he has a very extensive scholarly works on the Vietnamese politics, the ASEAN affairs, and as you might expect it, a very long history of engagement and experiences working with the state people on these topics. So our topic today is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And this is the organization has been one of the most high-profile regional organization in the recent history of international law and international relation also. However, until today, I think that the understanding of ASEAN views, politics, contributions, and identity within the Western-led liberal international order has never been the focus still. So the purpose of today, as you can see, is quite as elementary, you might say, but very research-oriented. We will discuss the foundational approach to ASEAN politics, the relationship between these countries, some insights about the Vietnam perspective, and the topic and the sources that you might need to read and learn about ASEAN. And lucky for our participant, I'm not the one who will be doing that today. Thank you, Dr. Giang, for being here. Welcome to CIC, and please take the lead about webinar. Thank you.
Yeah. Many thanks to Trung for the very kind introduction. And before we begin, I would like to thank the Canadian International Council, Trung and Chris, for inviting me to discuss with all of you today for a very important topic. So first, I would like to share the screen so we can start. That's probably easier for us to have something to follow, right? Can you see the screen now? Okay, I'm good. Yeah. So I think before I start, I think it's important to make a little bit of precaution. First, because I'm a bit researcher in Vietnamese politics, like Trung said, and focus mostly on Vietnam as well as Vietnam's foreign affairs. I can't claim to be an expert on ASEAN, although I'm very proud Southeast Asian. I think if I given the diversity and the complexity of ASEAN itself, very few people can claim as an expert on the whole ASEAN. So therefore, what I'm going to say here mostly about my own perception about the state of research on ASEAN and its member states, and mostly about my personal experience. I think it would set a very good foundation for us to have a very engaging discussion, not just a one-way lecture or speech. So many of you might be familiar with ASEAN or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations recently, especially when we have increasing interest on the Indo-Pacific. But most of the news we see on media about ASEAN is not very positive. From the ASEAN failure to prevent the crisis in Myanmar, its passive stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to its division over, the South China Sea dispute with China. And, many even believe that ASEAN as the organization, is a relic of the past and play no role in shaping the future of the most important region in the 21st century. I think that, some of the critics are fair, but some are a little bit harsh and ignorant of the historical context of ASEAN and its member states. And in order to have a better understanding of this very important region, Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific Shah of the Biden administration, recommend that Vietnam and India are the swing states of the 21st century. I think ASEAN is among the swing states of the 21st century, which can play a very important role in shaping the future of the world in this century. So I think we need more and more research into this reason. But of course, unfortunately, I think this is what is currently lacking in the scholarship, not only in Western countries, but also even among ourselves, people researching ASEAN. So I think that's why we're having this discussion now. So in my short talk, I basically have 4 main points to make before we have an open discussion. So first, I would like to give a very brief introduction why ASEAN matters and why researching ASEAN is very important for us in the coming time. And second, I will outline a few challenges of researching ASEAN as an entity and as individual states, because ASEAN, includes 10 and potentially 11 if Timor-Leste become a new member in the coming time. Very different, very diverse, region with a lot of complexity for us to understand. Third, I will outline some, sources and inspirations for people who, want to research or want to understand more about ASEAN from afar, from Canada or wherever in the world you are. Because I mean, even though after COVID it's easier for us to travel, it's not easy to buy a very expensive ticket and go to ASEAN and stay there for 2 months. It's not like just anyone can do that, right? And then I will outline the case for being there. Maybe 1 or twice, potentially in a few years. If you want to research ASEAN, it's probably better to be there for a few times and immerse yourself with the environment there and understand the everyday politics and life in Southeast Asia to get a better understanding of how lives there goes, instead of that depending on purely on news media or research paper. So why ASEAN? I think ASEAN is important because of because of itself, not because of its relations with the US or China, great power, right? It has nearly 7 million people, and most of them are young. 60% of such people are in the working age, and of course, because of that, they can play a very significant role in the global economy. And now, collectively, it's the 5th largest economy in the world, and it has everything. Basically, it has the biggest reserve in in coal, in oil. If you look at the South China Sea, It has the second biggest reserves in rare earths, which has been a very important minerals in the great power competition between China and US. It has young people. It has the biggest semiconductor manufacturing supply chains in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. So it's extremely important in terms of economic activities. And third, it's also very open in terms of trade relations as well. ASEAN, the core pillar of ASEAN is economic and trade relations. And the reason, although despite very diverse political regimes in one-party states like Vietnam and Laos, junta regime in Myanmar, monarchy in Thailand and Brunei, democracies in Indonesia and Thailand to some extent, they are very open in terms of trade relations and economics, and they have a lot of free trade agreements with many countries in the world, including Canada. And many of these members are now the signatories of the CPTPP, which is a very important trade pact, which Canada is also a member of. And that is, of course, it has growing influence in the increasingly polarized world because, as we might have known from a lot of discussions recently about the role of countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore in ASEAN when the United States and China have been in a very intensive competition over the geopolitical landscape in Asia. And because of the position, geographical and geopolitical positions of ASEAN, they are the key to swing between China and US, and many of the both China and US trying to have more influence in the region. That's why you see ASEAN has been featured much more frequently on news media recently than previously. So ASEAN is important, but what's so special about ASEAN? When we have in the world, we have a lot of regional organizations. Of course, most importantly is European Union. But ASEAN is so special in this. The first reason is that ASEAN has a very exciting history of regional reconciliation because it was first set up not as a regional cooperation body, but as a bulwark against communism actually. So it was considered as ASEAN NATO. And now when the previous anti-communist pact from Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and now ASEAN includes 3 former and current communist states: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and also include many different political regimes inside itself. So it's a very fascinating story of regional reconciliation, and I think that's the reason why we should appreciate ASEAN, as a very important organization in bringing peace in one of the most used to be one of the most bloody regions in the world during the Cold War. And because of that, ASEAN is very extremely diverse in terms of cultural, social, economic, and political backgrounds, like I said before. And just gives the reason why we have a very unique principle of working mechanism in ASEAN, which they call the ASEAN way, which mostly based on the principle of non-interference. That's why many criticize ASEAN for failing to sanction Myanmar for the Rohingya crisis in 2018, for example, and the Myanmar junta when they topple the democratically elected government of Myanmar in 2022. But this is the reason why ASEAN has the ASEAN way is that the most important principle of ASEAN is non-interference. They don't want to really interfere into domestic situations, whatever it is, in other member states. So we have this very interesting picture. The ASEAN way of holding hands amongst the leaders. It's actually showing the principle ASEAN way. And the second principle ASEAN way is that they really it depends on consensus. So if a decision is made, it must reach the consensus among all 10 member states. That also explains why ASEAN is very easily very vulnerable to manipulation from external powers, especially China, when it has the deepest pocket of all superpowers in the region. In 2012, for example, when Cambodia was the chairman of ASEAN, ASEAN at the time failed to deliver the conflict for the first time because Cambodia refused to give their consensus on ASEAN's stance on the South China Sea disputes. And we also see that recently the Philippines, for example, has been a very difficult time with China on the South China Sea dispute. And ASEAN failed to criticize China by name, even though last year's chairmanship was in Indonesia, which is not potentially, but actually the leader of ASEAN with 300 million people and I would say, used to have a very neutral stance on issues like the South China Sea. So for the background, now we come to the research challenges when we doing research on ASEAN and its member states. So researching ASEAN as an entity is difficult, and researching individual member states is also very difficult. So I would outline a little bit about like the both sides of the researching the entity and the individual states, and then we will discuss some methodological challenges when we research ASEAN. So as an entity, it's very difficult because ASEAN is unlike European Union. It lacks public engagement, and most of the decisions are very top-down approach, and they don't really have a very strong core institution like the European Commission, for example. And so most of the decisions of ASEAN are made behind closed door or in informal settings. ASEAN has a very kind of like opaque way of operation. So they don't really like argue with each other like in Western, way of arguing or making decisions. They rarely show their discord publicly. And a lot of decisions actually are made behind closed door, during like informal chatting or dinner instead of informal negotiations. So that's why the COVID-19 had a really big impact on the way the ASEAN worked because of COVID. Like they couldn't really meet face to face for like nearly 2 years, and it actually has a very devastating impact on ASEAN. And also, it has a ASEAN Secretariat based in Jakarta, Indonesia. But the Secretariat is less powerful and much less centralized like European Commission. And it doesn't really have a lot of power over its member states. And ASEAN, although it has ASEAN Charter, it doesn't really have a lot of like binding rules and regulations on its member states. So except, the freedom of movement, like traveling from one state to another, ASEAN has less, common things to European Union than many people imagine. We don't really have a common fiscal policies or monetary policies. We don't really have we have a kind of like common market in the way that we have inside ASEAN FTA, but we don't have common market in terms of regulation. So it's very different from European Union. And also, I think researching ASEAN as an entity is very difficult, and we don't really have a lot of experts who are very specialized in researching ASEAN. I think it's important for us to also read the work of first the people who used to work for ASEAN or used to engage a lot with ASEAN. In the case of Mr. Martin Dalegawan, the former Indonesian foreign minister, and who is very active in researching and providing opinions about ASEAN. And also we have the work of Bipak Nair, who is a senior lecturer at Australian National University, who also has very extensive fieldwork, engaging with senior and elite diplomats in Jakarta about the work of ASEAN. Here is Martin, and here is Deepak. And there's some work. I think the book Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within by Marty Natalegawa is very important for people who want to understand how ASEAN has become an entity like it is now, and what kind of principle and mechanisms ASEAN have, and also what kind of, in reality, what ASEAN actually works to solve regional common issues. For Deepak Nair, I think he has a very important work on the methodology considerations about how we research a very opaque, a very non-accessible entity like ASEAN. You can read the analytical essay hanging out while studying up when he mapped out the way that he carried out his ethnographic fieldwork in Jakarta when he researched the inner workings of ASEAN. So for researching individual states, it's even much more challenging than researching an entity because, like I said, ASEAN is extremely diverse in terms of everything: politics, society, culture, language. It's really challenging for you to be an expert of everything, right? So the same, you cannot be an expert on ASEAN because you can't be an expert on 10 different countries and 10 different, cultures. So the first is important to know the context when you research individual states. For example, when you research Vietnam, which I mostly spend my time on, you must know that Vietnam is one-party state, for example. So you must know how the inner workings of the communist state is very different from the way that other political regimes like monarchy or liberal democracy work. And if you focus the work in Thailand, for example, you must know the context that Thailand is actually a monarchy in a way that you cannot really criticize monarchy very strongly, otherwise you risk being arrested by the police in Thailand. And then you know the limits, of course, because ASEAN is very diverse regions, and there are many things that you need to keep in mind when you do research in this region. For example, when you want to research on the transnational crimes syndicates in ASEAN, which is a very big problem in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos now, you must know that it's very dangerous to be there without the local guide and without the proper understanding of the of the local context. If you want to do research in Singapore, for example, you must know that in Singapore, the state is very active in suing people who are trying to say something bad about the states in terms of like framing them as saying something libelous. And if you're doing research in Indonesia, you must know the context of the religious context of Indonesia as the biggest Muslim country in the world and also as biggest democracy in the world. So it has like different combinations of religion and political context, for example. Know the language is very important. It's not a necessity in a way that you can still research ASEAN and its member states by looking at English language literature. But I think it's much more recommended if you know a little bit of the language because not only you can have a first-hand experience in the primary sources in the original language, but also it's important to have a discussions with local experts or even local people because otherwise you just seeing your object from afar and you don't really understand how they think, how things work, and how life is different from the textbooks. So here is a few figure of the different in terms of population, GDP, gross domestic products in ASEAN. Very, very, very diverse. On methodological challenges, the first one, very important, is the lack of proper and reliable data in some countries' cases. And it is obvious for people who research in ASEAN because some countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, it's very hard for you to find a very reliable, very good statistical data. It's not because that the transparency in those countries are are not really good, but also the fact that the capacity of the state in those countries to really, carrying out a very good and very, with due diligence, the statistical, surveys is not really as good as you might see in other cases. I mean, of course, if you look at the data you have in Vietnam, for example, it's probably better than in China, in the way that many international organizations like World Bank, IMF, ASEAN Development Bank, they also funded a lot of survey, projects in ASEAN countries and provide them with the capacity to carry out survey. But those funding are not enough, of course. You always, like money in carrying out a survey. So it's important when you look at, if you are, quantitative researcher and you look at the data in ASEAN, you must know the limits or the the weakness of those data when you carrying out quantitative analysis. And that is not easy either to do field trip or interview with our local knowledge, because I've been to a few ASEAN, not all ASEAN states, but my perception of talking to people in ASEAN people in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand is that we tend to not to say something very publicly. We totally like want to provide criticisms. We are trying to be polite and we rarely say no. And so there is a lot of nuances when you doing field trips, when you interview to local people. Maybe you do a survey about ASEAN perception of Canada, for example, like, and you say like 99% of ASEAN people who are interviewed in our survey, like say they love Canada. Maybe it's not true because they probably just say that because of politeness, not that because of they actually know or they actually love Canada. So you have to be very careful in the way you shape the interview and the way you interpret how the interview is. And second, it's also important to immerse yourself with the locals, because if you do qualitative research, interviewing people or doing experiments in on the field in Southeast Asia, and if you do not gain the trust of the local people, it's nearly impossible for you to get anything out of the talk with them. So it's very important for you to have a local knowledge, which is very difficult when you do field trips or interviews in such country. And then of course experiments is difficult as well, not only because of the very challenges, many challenging situations when you apply for the for the regulations to carry out experiments in countries, but also it's very hard to recruit people to do experiments as well. And then bureaucracy, of course, may be very troublesome. In countries like Vietnam, for example, if you are an anthropologist and you want to research ethnic minorities in sensitive regions in Vietnam, the Central Highlands or the Northeast region of Vietnam, it's nearly impossible because the state might be suspicious of your activities. They maybe believe that no, you actually not doing any research, but you're doing some missionary work, and you might pose some kind of like security risk to the country. And so applying the requirements to research in such countries is actually very, very difficult as well. So, if you plan to do so, you must be very well prepared for that. And of course, the last thing, but very important, last but not least, is that doing research might be a very dangerous business, not just in complex areas. I mean, it's obvious if you research the ongoing conflicts in Myanmar, for example, or the the transnational crime syndicates in the Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, and Thailand. It's difficult, but then even without being in those very dangerous areas, it might also be very dangerous for you if you do research in normal countries like in Thailand, for example. If you say something bad about monarchy, or in Cambodia, if you're doing some politically sensitive research, which might displace the the government in Phnom Penh, it might be also very dangerous for you as well and put you in a very tough situations. And of course, as a non-ASEAN people, it might be easier for you to do so because you just leave the reason. But for the ASEAN people who actually want to do the research about the reason, it's really pose very complicated question about how to balance your dedication to research and to your safety. And it's not always easy for you to balance such thing in the increasingly more challenging situation in Southeast Asia. All right. So on researching from some sources and inspirations, I guess that many of you are much better than mine in having sources and your own inspirations about how to research ASEAN. But I just provide my very limited knowledge about what I think would be very interesting for you to get a little bit understanding of ASEAN. So if you want to research ASEAN, of course, you can go to official sources, various websites, thanks to the internet and thanks to, uh, Google. Now we can have a lot of access to various websites from ASEAN itself and from individual states, especially if you do statistical analysis. Countries like Vietnam, for example, have the General Statistical Office where you can download data and then you can interpret data by yourself without any I think difficulty in technique. And then you have regional think tanks like my own institution, ICS, in Singapore, where you can not only have access to many data, but also a lot of research journals and articles and commentaries on on contemporary ASEAN and also very diverse topics on ASEAN itself. We also have a CSIS Indonesia, so it's different from CSIS in Washington, which also provide many interesting viewpoints, mostly from Indonesia about the reason. Indonesia is the leader of ASEAN. I mean, like obviously ASEAN doesn't have a formal leader because they want to emphasize on equality, but as Indonesia as the host of the Secretariat, as the biggest nation in terms of economic scale and in terms of the population, is the natural leader of ASEAN. So I think it's important when you look at ASEAN, you also have to look at the way that the foreign policy in Indonesia works as well. We also have some regional academic institutions who can provide a lot of niche knowledge on ASEAN. In Singapore, you have, of course, like National University of Singapore and US, and then you have the Nanyang Technology University as well. Both are amazing universities with a lot of good research programs and topics that you can dig in. And even if some of you want to do some exchange, such university are amazing opportunities and choices for you. Then in Thailand, you have the Chulalongkorn University and Thammasat. Thammasat, for example, they have amazing library and bookstore about ASEAN. So if you happen to be in Bangkok, when you spend some time on the beach in Phuket and maybe spend some time eating street food, you can spend some time as well in Thammasat and exploring a bookstore in Thammasat. It's amazing. It has a lot of books on ASEAN as entity in ASEAN, as with member states in ASEAN, so Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that you can have a look at. And then in Vietnam, of course, you have the Vietnam National University, which has a very good departments on Southeast Asian studies and ASEAN as well. In Malaysia, you have University of Malaya, and so on and so forth. So many institutions that you can, if you are interested, in one of the individual states, I recommend you to look at the academic institutions in those countries and have a look at how they see themselves and how they research their own country to have a little bit knowledge about that local knowledge. And it's important why I recommend such institutions, because when you think about researching Southeast Asia and ASEAN, like most of the research actually carried out by Western scholars, not by local researchers like people like Chung, for example, or people who are based in ASEAN countries. So I think it's important to kind of like give voice to voices, because when you think of ASEAN as a as a topic, and then most of the research is carried out by people outside ASEAN, it's kind of like it might lack the context in some way, and it might not interpret fully the way that ASEAN people think about themselves. So I think it's important to balance such scholarship between people inside ASEAN and people outside ASEAN. So when we want to know more comprehensively about ASEAN, it's probably better to combine both the knowledge inside and outside ASEAN. Also on regional sources, I think it's important to also follow some, regional experts on each country. So here in the picture is very famous Thai political scientist, Thitanan. You have he's from Chulalongkorn University, and he comment widely about the topic related to Thai foreign policy and Thai politics as well. And you have Lê Hồng Hiệp from my own institution, who researches on Vietnam, Keung from Northern Illinois University in US, but focus on Cambodia. Okay, and then you have quasi-regional publications. I call it quasi-regional publications because they're from Australia. But because Australia is geographically very close to Southeast Asia, they consider themselves as a part of ASEAN, not ASEAN, but Asia continent. And so they also spend a lot of money and a lot of resources on publications and institutions on ASEAN, including the East Asia Forum Interpreter and the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at University of Sydney. External research institutions, they're amazing people, and of course, including Canadian institutions as well, as the department from McGill, for example. And you have prominent Southeast Asianists like Dan Slater from University of Michigan or Tom Pepensky featured on this picture, and Eddie Malesky from Duke, who are amazing researchers on individual states in Southeast Asia that you can follow them. I personally follow them on Google Scholar and Twitter. Google Scholar for research topics and papers, and Twitter for their, or X now, for their opinions on ongoing, situations in Southeast Asia. And of course, you must choose your interest wisely because, like I said, it's like 10 different countries and different culture, political situations. So you have to focus your energy on your niche interest, because otherwise you would be very kind of like it's very hard to pick the information in the sea of information you have now about Southeast Asia. And then you have like new generation Southeast Asianists, some very young, very aspiring political scientists who do research on Southeast Asia that you can follow. Here in the picture, you have Nicole Curato, who has a lot of work on the Philippines, especially under the Duterte administration. You have Evan Lasmana from IISS based in Singapore, who has amazing research on foreign policy of ASEAN and Indonesia. They have Dr. Mai Chung from McGill University in US, focusing mostly on Vietnam. And you have Napong from ICS, myself, focusing on Thailand. They combine their knowledge and many advanced methodological tools, including quantitative research and qualitative tools to research Southeast Asia. So I think it's important to keep in mind the balance between the old generation, kind of old, not really, and the new generation of Southeast Asianists who combine new technique with their knowledge on researching and understanding Southeast Asia. And there are also other channels if you want to get to know Southeast Asia and ASEAN well, including some podcasts. I personally really enjoy the podcasts by CIC Stories of Sydney University and the CSIS Southeast Asia Radio. They publish bi-weekly, so you can spend like less than 1 hour to listen. Very interesting and very contemporary topic. And then of course it's important for you to potentially to be in Southeast Asia maybe a few times, because you will challenge the perception with reality. When you talk to people who know the story, who know how life is going in Southeast Asia, you probably have a better understanding of the life in Southeast Asia. and then you build your own interest and network. It's important because, like I said, ASEAN politics are mostly done in informal settings. And then it's wonderful place to travel. And for the sake of traveling, it's a beautiful, diverse, culturally interesting, cheap place to spend money as well. So yeah, and you have some time and have some interest in Southeast Asia. Definitely, it is a must for you to be there, once in a while. All right, thank you very much, and really great to talk with you, and really looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Anjan. That's the perfect timing, actually. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very concise, yes, so informative. Before we move to the Q&A section for our audience, I think I have just 1 or 2 questions for you so that our participant can have some time to warm up. So the first question I have is, we have a very recent report about the political references of the ASEAN population. So they were asked, like, if they has to choose between China and Vietnam, and I'm sorry, China and the US. The report now say that they overwhelmingly choose China as the referred partner if they had to choose, which is reversal of view, because in 2022 and way before that, I think they mostly choose the US. So do you think that report is on methodology speaking, is that a good report, and how can we interpret that report? Yeah, that's the first question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very interesting because that report actually was published by institution, the ICS, and they actually not a kind of like a report in the sense that just report, actually a report based on a survey, early survey actually. So the methodology that you survey a wide range of experts on Southeast Asia, mostly the people who are based in Southeast Asia, about the state of Southeast Asia for the last year, and so it can vary quite significantly depending on the situation unfolds. So if you look at the list of countries who potentially switch alliance from US to China, it's mostly because of the ongoing conflict in Gaza, in Middle East. Probably Chris can jump in and talk more. Countries like in Malaysia, in Brunei, and Indonesia, they are majority Muslim countries, and of course, because of the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the very inaction or very unhelpful intervention of the United States in the Middle East, as I see it, drive their perception from being close to US to being close to China. But if you look at the Philippines and Vietnam, which have an ongoing disputes with China on the South China Sea, actually more experts in Philippines and Vietnam shifted their perception from being close to China to being close to US. So it actually vary depending on the political situations in each year. And secondly, I think it's important to note that it's an early survey, right? You kind of like survey like 7 million people in Southeast Asia, and I think most of them don't care. Basically, like most of them just spend their life and trying to earn a good living and being aspiring, take startup for example. They don't really care about politics. So this is early survey. So early survey depending on how like people like myself or people like you express your opinions about one topic. So that is some precautions when you interpret the data. Nevertheless, it's also important to note, about how Southeast Asian experts think about the engagement between China and US, not only in the region but also in other regions in the world. So I think it's when you interpret the such a survey, you really must take a lot of precautions first, and second, you also need to see between the lines like how you can interpret that and how you can bring good insights from the survey.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Trung, we do have the Q&A down below for anyone that wants to ask questions, but I have a couple of questions. And on one point on the research side, based on my own field work in countries where there are, political challenges, issues, it's easy for us to come from, say, democracies like Canada to breeze into a country, interview a lot of people and think nothing about it. But after you leave, uh, the state that you're in could actually be quite interested to know what you were talking about, and you've left those folks behind. So it's always something to keep in the back of your mind. But so I had two questions. One, because I'm old school and I'm on the internet all the time, but what is the leading newspaper in your mind when it comes to covering ASEAN issues? The one you go to, the one place you would go to first, perhaps? That would be the first question. The second question is, we all have our eyes on China from a research perspective, but also from, just interested to know what China is doing. And we're doing that from Canada. But for the nations that are in ASEAN, they're looking at China, I would say, yes, we have the South China Seas, but there are economic issues inside the country, many, many issues. And what are some of the concerns that the countries have around China as to the future of that country economically, for example?
Yeah, many thanks for very great questions. On the first questions, I actually have a list of newspapers which regularly write about ASEAN, which I normally look at on contemporary issues. First is the Straits Times in Singapore, very good newspaper. Then you have Nikkei Asia Review. They regularly cover ASEAN as well. And you have the South China Morning Post, also write very extensively about the recent. You have other individual newspaper from individual state like Bangkok Post in Thailand, which cover really well, of course, like Thai, you know, viewpoint about different situations in Southeast Asia. So that is for, let's say, like breaking news and contemporary news. But for analytical viewpoint, uh, I normally go to East Asia Forum, Interpreter, and Fulcrum. Of course, is a place where I write my monthly column, mostly of Vietnamese foreign policy and politics. So Fulcrum was set up by ICS, Christoph Bishop, a few years ago, and we try to make it as a platform for giving opinions about ongoing, both in depth and fast commentaries about the ongoing different situations in Southeast Asia. So I really recommend you have a look at the website for commentaries and analysis on Southeast Asia. On your second question, I think it's important to note that ASEAN would never try to choose between US and China, and that is because to quote a very classic song, Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like. You can never leave because China is a giant and it's neighbor of ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, for example. We have a very bad relationship with China for maybe thousands of years, but after that, we always have to come to China and give a hand, make peace because you know you cannot choose your neighbors, and that for the fact is very important for ASEAN countries to think about how to make the decision. Before 2008, so before the rise of China, basically, most ASEAN countries, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, were very happy with the duality of having China as the provider of trade and economic benefits. China is now the biggest trade partner of all ASEAN countries, literally. And then you have the US as the provider of security. So you have the duality of trade economic relations on one side with China and security with US on the other side. But for the past 10 years, it's increasingly difficult for ASEAN to be so because, of course, China wants to exert more political and influence social influence over Southeast Asian regions, especially the countries that are close to China, like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then Philippines. And then at the top, as a point, when U.S. is distracted in the Middle East, distracted with the one Ukraine, and Southeast Asian countries begin to question their choice, whether it would be smart, it would be wise for you to just depend your security on one superpower who regularly distracts by other activities at global scale, and then they develop a stance, and that's what they call strategic autonomy. So when you basically you don't choose, but you flexibly shift your attention to one point on another and try to walk a fine line between US and China to maximize the benefits while reducing the cost. And doing so, they try to come together as the group, because of course it's always easier for you to, let's say, negotiate with China as a group than as the individual state. And so that's the reason why countries like Vietnam, for example, has been increasingly supportive of ASEAN, because they know that without a very a collective identity like ASEAN, it's very hard for countries like Vietnam or Philippines to deal with China, the China question in terms of security, because they cannot depend on US solely. But at the same time, they want to maintain very good, very cordial trade and economic relations with China, because at the end of the day, it's economic stupid, right? It's to quote Bill Clinton's campaign speak. So yeah, I think it's a very big question, very hard question for ASEAN countries to choose. But now I think they're trying to hash between China and US, and at the same time finding the third way of strategic autonomy.
Oh, thank you for that. And I know we're running out of time, but could I just quickly follow up? AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK pact, defense pact, how is that reverberating in the countries in the region?
Well, I think it's a very, very interesting question, because, like I said, ASEAN is very diverse organization with different member states and different priorities. So for maritime Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, they're not really happy with AUKUS in the way that it provides Australia as a new nuclear countries, with the submarines. But at the same time, countries like Philippines and Vietnam, which are having a dispute with China on the South China Sea, they welcome, although not publicly, then they don't publicly welcome AUKUS, but they welcome AUKUS during informal settings, like I said about ASEAN, because they know that with AUKUS, there could be another counterbalancing against China influence on the South China Sea, and in terms of real politics, it's helpful for them. It's helpful for smaller nations like Philippines or Vietnam to have another counterbalance against Beijing increasing influence in the region. So I think that's also a source of disunity among ASEAN, like the way that China has tried to drive a wedge in Southeast Asia. Because for the South China Sea, for example, only 5 or 6 Southeast Asians are claimant states. But for Cambodia, for Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, they don't really have any interest at all in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea. So that's why it's easier for Beijing to come and say, look, you don't have any interest at all in the South China Sea. Why do you risk being punished by China? So here's some 6 million investments, take it, and then don't say anything about the South China Sea. So that's actually what China, is doing about that. AUKUS also poses the same, dilemma inside Southeast Asia, but I think to lesser extent, because I think the US and Australia can actually convince other, dissatisfied Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia about the purpose of AUKUS, how they can be helpful to countries in the region to counterbalance China's increasingly militarized activities in South China Sea, and to maintain the region as a more, peaceful and stable region for trade and business.
Thank you so much for that insightful answer, all of them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question, Chris. Our participant, if you have any question, please continue to type them in. We have one question about the topic, ASEAN topic and countries. So the question is that what are the ASEAN topic and country in your like top three that international observer and international researcher should like, look out for, watch out for in the next few years? Can you give us some idea about that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like if you look at the way the ASEAN has been portrayed in news media and in research communities, the first one, of course, is geopolitics. You know how ASEAN um, can muddle through the very challenging geopolitical situation in the Indo-Pacific between China and US, and how they can optimize their position for their benefit. Recently, of course, Vietnam has been a very interesting place to study because it was considered as the country with who gained the most benefit from standing between China and US. Now, having more investment from US while increasing their trade relations with China. The second topic, of course, is how ASEAN can reform itself to cope with the new challenges. Because ASEAN has been very successful, like I said, to reconciliate former enemies and rivals to make a very, used to be a very bloody region to become one of the most peaceful regions in the world. Uh, until a few years ago, but now it cannot use the consensus or it cannot use the non-interference principle as it is now to maintain peace and stability in the region. Because if you look at Myanmar, if you look at the way that other, the narrative of violence and narrative of and other transnational situations like climate change, the Mekong issues, you cannot use non-interference as as a way to go through all those questions. You have to reform yourself. So ASEAN reform, I think, it's very important topic as well. And the third, of course, is ASEAN is about trade and economics, right? So it's important to probably to look at how ASEAN can um, foster economic cooperation not only among ASEAN member states but also between ASEAN and other countries. So, recently we have the RCEP, the Regional Economic Cooperation, kind of like FTA between ASEAN and many countries in the region. But also, we have many ASEAN member states have the trade pact with Canada, United States, in the CPTPP. The United States probably join later, but the way that ASEAN can guide their organization and its member states from, being a little bit like passive in politics and in economics to become a kind of like a centrality of attracting more trade and economic relations with other country and to solve the political and social issues. I think it's all very important as well. So I think that's the three things I think we can focus. First is geopolitics, the second is inner working of ASEAN, and the third is, economics and trade.
Thank you very much for the very succinct answer. And Chris, do you think that we should wrap it up right now, or is this you have more question or something?
Well, I don't see any questions in the Q&A area, and
Yeah.
I know it's coming up to coffee break in Australia. So we should probably wrap it up. Trung, if you wanted to thank our speaker and everybody that joined us today, that would be great.
Okay. So that is it for us today. I hope the insights coming from Dr. Giang encourage our audience to read and explore and research more about ASEAN. Thank you, Dr. Giang, for your precious time and very helpful presentation. And thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate your time. And Dr. Giang, do you want to say goodbye to our audience from CIC?
Sure. First, thank you very much, Chung and Chris, for the opportunities, and really enjoy our discussion. And many thanks to other participants in this webinar. And if you have any questions, just drop me an email or message. Really welcome any further discussion you have. And many thanks, and have a great weekend in Canada. Maybe tomorrow, right? It's Friday
tomorrow,
here.
yeah.
Probably it's
almost.
Yeah.
All
Almost,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Trung, thank you for hosting and very interesting. So we will pick up this again at some point. And so, yes, Take care and see you. Trung, I'll see you next week when the Japanese ambassador is here. All
Yeah.
right. Goodbye,
Thank
everybody.
Chris.
Bye.
Thanks, Anne.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.